All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Coastal Sharks Management Board. We'll go ahead and get the meeting started. My name is Adam Nowalski, and I'm joined by staff Ashton Harp to my right. Our first order of business here today is to approve the agenda. Is there any objection to the agenda as provided? Seeing none, we'll accept that. Our second order of business is to approve the proceedings and minutes from the 2015 meeting. Is there any objection to accepting those as provided? Seeing none, they will be approved. Our next order of business is any public comment for issues not on the agenda. We don't have anybody presently signed up. Pretty thin. Does anybody need to speak on an issue not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move right along. Our next two items, one of which will require an action, is to discuss the differences in the state and federal smoothhound catch composition and regulations for processing at sea, and then that'll lead into the 2016 quota. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Ashton for a presentation.
Thank you. Okay, so this presentation is actually going to go over a little bit more than the processing at sea changes. It's going to kind of outline the memo that was sent in December that kind of explains the differences in federal and state management measures for smoothhound as a result of the Amendment 9 final rule that was released at the end of November. So as you can see on the board now, smoothhound is a federally managed species, which means it has a federal quota, which is 1201.7 metric tons for the 2016 fishing year. I've gone ahead and allocated the coast-wide quota for states because in Addendum 2 of the Coastal Sharks Fisheries Management Plan, smoothhound had state shares. We were just waiting to implement the state shares until we had a federal quota. So you can see how the percentages and the breakdowns will be by state. Just as a background, the percentages are based on historical catch from 1998 through 2010, if you're kind of trying to think of how do we get to these percentages. So the federal and state quotas, so the final rule from Amendment 9 will become effective on March 15, 2016, so therefore the state shares will then become effective at that time as well. One point to note in the differences, so in the federal waters, when the landings are projected to reach or have reached 80% of the coast-wide quota, HMS will close down the Atlantic shark fishery, which would include the smoothhound fishery. However, the state allocations that I showed on the previous slide allocate the full coast-wide quota up to 100%. So fishermen with a state permit can continue to fish even after the federal fishery is closed. And I'm just noting here in the blue that the board will take action to set the 2016 smoothhound quota at this meeting because it was not part of the 2016 specifications for Atlantic sharks that was set in December. So for recreational permits, I just want to note that Amendment 9 requires recreational anglers fishing in federal waters to have an HMS angling or HMS charter headboat recreational permit for retention of recreationally caught smoothhound sharks. So there's no changes between this and the Coastal Sharks FMP that we have. There are no specific management measures for recreationally caught smoothhound sharks in state waters. There's no minimum recreational size limits or possession limits at this time for smoothhound sharks. Commercial permits, this is just simply to note that in federal waters it is required to have a federal commercial smoothhound permit. These will be required as of March 15th of 2016. This does not affect anyone who just has a state permit and would like to remain having a state-only permit. So the commercial possession limits, Amendment 9 did not set a commercial retention limit for smoothhounds. As you know, with large coastal sharks, we have possession limits that we set. For smoothhounds, that is not the case. So as stated in Addendum 2 to the Coastal Sharks FMP, the board will not set possession limits for smoothhound sharks once the federal coastwide quota has been implemented, which it has. States can establish a specific management program to achieve but not exceed their state quota. So now moving on to processing at sea. So Amendment 9 allows commercial federal fishermen to remove the fins of smooth dogfish if it meets the following 4 criteria. So all 4 are required for federal fishermen and for state fishermen. So the fisherman must have a federal commercial smoothhound permit and possess a state commercial fishing license. If you're only in state waters, you only need the state license. Number 2 is highlighted in blue. It's because it's a change. So 25% of the retained catch on the vessel must be smooth dogfish to process at sea. This is now in the federal FMP. It is not in the Coastal Sharks FMP, so it is something for the board to consider. The vessel must be located between the shore and 50 nautical miles. We have this in our FMP now. And the fin to carcass ratio does not exceed 12%. We also have this in the Coastal Sharks FMP. For dealer permits, Amendment 9 requires dealers to possess an Atlantic shark dealer permit to purchase smoothhound sharks. Permits are available, and dealers must report smoothhound shark purchases on a weekly basis. So as stated in the Coastal Sharks FMP, a federal commercial shark dealer permit is required to buy and sell any sharks caught in state waters. So we already had this in the FMP. No changes need to be made. For gill net gear, Amendment 9 requires smoothhound fishermen to limit soak times to 24 hours when using sink gill net gear and conduct a net check at least every 2 hours when using drift gill net gear. So this does present a change between the federal and state FMPs. The Coastal Sharks FMP does not define sink or drift gill net. Rather, it identifies small mesh versus large mesh gill nets. Addendum 1 of the Coastal Sharks FMP removed the 2-hour net check requirement for commercial fishermen using large mesh gill nets. So the board could consider adding this back into the Coastal Sharks FMP if they wanted to. So this kind of just highlights the issues for consideration. So if the board would like state waters regulations to be consistent with federal measures, it would require an addendum to the Coastal Sharks FMP. Specifically for the following: the processing at sea, we would need to include 25% retained catch on the vessel is smoothhound in order for fishermen to process at sea. And the gill net gear is another consideration as well that should be considered. Questions?
Okay, thank you for that presentation. We'll turn to the board for questions of Ashton on the presentation. And again, in order for the measures at the present time to be complementary between state and federal waters, there are the 2 issues that were highlighted in the presentation: processing at sea with the catch composition, and then the issue of the gill net gear, just to reiterate those items. Questions for Ashton? All right, seeing none, we can go ahead and entertain potential action on that disconnect, have discussion about the disconnect, or if there are no concerns from board members about it, we would move into the 2016 quota. Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly support and appreciate the service doing the 25% to allow processing at sea. I would just ask, from an enforcement standpoint, the 24 hours is not that difficult to enforce, but every 2 hours, I don't know how we, at least in state waters, how we would patrol that, and so I'm not sure about that part. But to get the ball rolling, I would recommend that the Coastal Shark Board consider adopting the 25% retained catch on the vessel for smoothhounds for processing at sea.
So to go that route, that would require a motion to initiate an addendum. Are you doing so?
Yes, sir.
Do you wish for that motion to be just on that issue, or do you want to combine it with the gill net issue at all?
I would prefer to have further discussion, and if someone would like to amend my motion to include the soak times, that would be fine, but I certainly support the processing at sea issue. I just don't know enough about the gill net gear and how NIMS is going to enforce that, and number 2, how we would. That seems to be a very difficult, onerous task to commit to.
Okay, so your motion then is to initiate an addendum to address the disconnect for the processing at sea between state and federal waters.
Yes, sir.
Give us a moment to get that up on the board. I see Brandon Muffley's hand up as a second. We'll get that up. While we're getting that up, can I see a show of hands for any discussion on that issue? Got one. Okay, let us get it up before we do. We'll give staff a moment to get that up. In the meantime, I will turn to Eric for discussion on the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of questions. Should it say at least 25%? And is that 25% round weight or dressed weight, or what kind of weight are we talking about?
So we'll get that up on the board, and then we can address perfecting it. And I will have to turn to staff for the clarification on dressed, round, or other.
I would go to NOAA since it was their final rule, just to confirm on the dressed versus round.
Great, go ahead.
So I believe it's dressed weight.
I see your hand, Mike. Let's get the motion up completely, so if we need to perfect it, we can get that done first.
Adam, may I ask Margot a question? For the
Yeah, go ahead.
in the rule, is it at least 25% or is it 25%?
I think at least would cover it, and it's got to be greater than 25%. So at least.
At least, okay. Thank you.
Okay, so the motion that we have up right now, move to initiate an addendum to the Coastal Sharks FMP to address the disconnect of the processing at sea. Commercial fishermen can remove the fins of smooth dogfish if at least 25% of retained catch is smooth dogfish. That satisfactory, Dr. Daniel? Getting a nod of the head. Brandon as well? Okay, so that's the motion we have before the board. I've got Mr. Luisi and then Mr. Augustine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I appreciate the need to have measures in federal and state waters that mirror one another in many cases, if maybe somebody could, maybe either staff or NOAA could just provide some of a little bit of the background as to why the 25%, rather than having no percentage of the catch retained. What's the significance of having at least 25% of the catch, of the retained catch, be smooth dogfish?
Okay, again, that was through Amendment 9. I'll turn to NOAA for a clarification and for the reason in that in the final rule.
So this is to implement the Shark Conservation Act of 2010, which included a number of provisions, which are what was outlined before about 50 nautical miles from shore and the state permit. This particular provision was to implement the requirement that the individual be fishing for smooth dogfish. And so we had proposed in the draft several criteria, 25%, 50%, 75%. We had preferred 75% to make sure that it was a real directed trip During the public comment period, we got a lot of input from folks that the fishery was much more mixed than what we had initially realized. And so upon further review of the data, looking at things a little bit differently, we ultimately concluded that 25% of the catch would meet that test of fishing for smooth dogfish. So that was the reason.
Mr. Augustine?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to amend the motion to include the gillnet. And if you want to use the language that you had in your presentation, I think it would be more clear than what I would write. So if you want to put it up there. And if I get a second on it, I'd like to speak to it, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so that would, the issue at hand there was with regards to the definition of the sink versus the drift gillnet. So
That's
you
correct.
would move to add to the addendum a definition of sink and drift gillnet.
That's correct.
Do I have a second to that amendment? Do I have a second to that amendment? Seeing none, the motion fails for lack of a second. We'll go back to comments on the original motion. I've got Dr. Daniel, Emerson, and then Rob O'Reilly.
It was appropriately pointed out to me that, and if Brandon will indulge me, when these guys come in, they take the heads off as well. So these fish, when they come in, they're coarse, they're headed, they're gutted, and they're finned, and they have to retain all the fins. But if we could, I hope it would be just a perfection to remove the head and fins, because, and I don't know if that raises a red flag for nymphs or not, but it doesn't seem like it does. So if you're okay with that, Brandon, I'd like to friendly amend my motion to just say, can remove the head and fins of smooth dogfish, please.
So having had discussion, is there any objection from the board to that modification to the motion? Okay, I got 2 hands went up, so we can't just go ahead and amend it. Let me turn to those comments. Let me go down the list that I had here of people who wanted to speak. I'll add those 2, and then we can come back to that, and if we need to, we can entertain a motion to amendment. Let me first go to Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a question here about terminology. The question was asked a couple minutes ago, 25% catch weight, and the nymph's response was that's dressed weight. So it seems to me like we have to process dogfish here in order to get to the 25% to see if we can have processed dogfish on board, unless there's a definition that gutting or heading and gutting is not processing these fish. So I need some clarification on that, please.
I'll turn to Noah for that clarification again.
Right, so by dressed, we mean head gutted. It's basically a log or a core that's coming back. The difference for sharks, other than smooth dogfish, is that they can still be dressed, but the fins have to remain attached. So there's different ways of cutting so that you can still process but keep the fins attached. And the exception is for smooth dogfish, that they can be fully dressed, headed, gutted, and the fins removed at sea. For all the other sharks, the fins can be removed dockside. So that's so headed and, finned at sea, that's consistent with what we're doing. So it's a full processing at sea is what this is allowing. Does that make sense?
Follow up to that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I address nymphs directly? Is that okay? In a way, I understand what you're saying, but it doesn't make sense to me. Unless the definition of processing is just removing the fins. Because if processing includes gutting and heading, you're not supposed to do that until you've got 25% on board of dogfish, dressed weight. So you have to start processing fish before you know if you've got 25% of fish to start processing, but you've already processed them.
So the regulation is phrased in a way that that 25% is determined at the point of landing. And so that enables fishermen to process as they're going. They just need to watch the percentages before they come back.
Okay, thank you. I had Rob O'Reilly's hand was up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My comment was about the headed. That I thought was a friendly motion.
I'll turn to the two people who raised their hand when I asked if there was any opposition for clarification on that matter. First, I had Pat Augustine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Margot clarified it for me, and I could support that.
Okay, so you no longer oppose that original maker of the motion's amendment. Eric Reed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If the language was fully dressed, I would have no problems. Fishermen can fully dress smooth dogfish. Thank you.
I'll turn back to Dr. Daniel.
I have no problem with that as long as it's clear that they can head them, fin them, and gut them. And if that fully dressed accomplishes that without concern from enforcement or other members of the board, then I have no problem with that as a friendly amendment. It's up to Brandon.
So I'll turn to staff and the service for whether fully dressed would be the correct phrase to use here with relation to the intent of head, gut, and fin.
Noah, did you have any comments on that?
I think it might be clear to maybe have a parenthetical, fully dress, i.e. remove heads, fins, guts, etc. That might kind of meet both purposes and be clear.
Eric, are you comfortable with that? Dr. Daniel, you okay with that? Mr. Muffley, you're okay? Okay, so the original maker has amended the motion to now read, move to initiate an addendum to the Coastal Sharks FMP to address the disconnect of the processing at sea. Commercial fishermen can fully dress, parentheses, remove head and fin and gut at sea, close parentheses, smooth dogfish if at least 25% of the retained catch is smooth dogfish. Is there any objection by the board to that modification to the motion? Okay, seeing none, that is the current motion before the board. Further discussion on the motion? Turn to Mr. Hasbrook again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So does that mean that somebody who has less than 25% of dogfish on board has to land them whole? You know, if you've got 200 pounds of dogfish, for instance, in a trip of something else, you have to land those dogfish round, whole?
Based on Amendment 9, yes. I'll turn to Noah to.
So they would have to keep the fins on through the point of landing, but would be able to dress the fish in another way. So remove the heads and the guts, but the fins would have to stay on through landing.
Further questions or need for clarification? Seeing none, I will give the board a moment to caucus. All right, we'll go ahead. I'll ask all those in favor of the motion to raise your right hand, please. All those opposed, like sign. Abstentions? Null votes? Motion carries 14 to 0 to 0. Okay, so that brings us back to whether the board would like to consider the Gillnet question. Seeing the service, go ahead.
I would just offer the background on this, that this is a requirement of our biological opinion where net checks are required for drift gillnet to enable the live release of protected species, particularly turtles. And the sink gillnet check for 24 hours was a new provision added to address sturgeon bycatch, and so to enable the live release of sturgeon in that gear type. So just informational.
And I'll ask, what concerns, if any, would the service had if there was no action taken by the board here today on this?
So, as I said, this is a requirement of our biological opinion for federal fisheries. The net checks requirement has been in place for a number of years and has not posed any particular difficulties for the fishermen or for enforcement. Obviously, the gillnet provision is new, so I don't have any background or experience in that. So I think the concern without complementary regulations would be potential increased mortality of protected species. But I think that would be the extent.
Okay, well, not seeing any hands raised on this issue. Are you raising your hand? Okay, I'll turn to Pat Augustine.
In view of the fact I did not, Mr. Chairman, get a second on the motion the first time, could I bring it back on for, to try to get a second? So we would be consistent with the plan and with the feds?
Based on the fact that the discussion earlier was that the desire was to have them discussed separately, I'll go ahead and allow you to make that motion as a separate issue versus amending the previous motion.
May I do that, sir?
So you'd like to initiate another addendum to treat it separately, or you want to add it to this addendum?
I'd like to add it. It didn't pass when I tried to add it to that first motion, so if I can add it as another item within this addendum, Mr. Chairman, I think that would be appropriate. Treat it as a separate element by itself. If the board so desires not to approve it, it'll drop dead of its own weight. And if they do, we can go forward with it as a single unit. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I'm going to, even though it's very similar, I'll allow the motion based on the fact that we had the discussion about wanting to treat them separately. So your motion will be to include the gillnet provision from Amendment 9 in the addendum.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Is there a second to that? Is there a second to that? Seeing none, the motion fails for lack of a second. Okay, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is the 2016 smoothhound quota.
Okay, so the 2016 quota, so next slide. I just wanted to put on the record that there was an electronic vote in December. So at the annual meeting, there were the 2016 coastal shark specifications that we tabled. And I just want to note that we did move to adopt the 2016 coastal shark specifications, specifically a start date of January 1, 2016, and a variable possession limit, which will start at 36 large coastal sharks per vessel per trip, i.e. aggregated large coastal sharks and hammerhead shark management groups. States will follow NIMS for in-season changes in the possession limit. So that was passed in December. What we did not pass was the smoothhound quota because that had not been released yet. So before you is the slide that I showed earlier. These are just the allocations. But what we're looking for today is just to set the commercial quota for the Atlantic region of 1201.7 metric tons.
Any questions for Ashton on that? Question, or did you have a motion, Emerson? Go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to digress too much here, but in seeing that I'm relatively new to the board, how did we end up with state-by-state allocation with smooth dogfish? The short version.
Ashton?
I only have the short version because I've just read up a little bit on it. So this was initiated and the amendment passed in 2013, and from what I gathered, people felt that there should be a smoothhound state shares, although there wasn't a quota, there wasn't a stock assessment that had been done at smoothhound at that time. So we decided, the commission decided to proceed with the state allocations, but wait until the commercial quota, the feds release the commercial quota.
So we've had those in place, those shares, but they haven't actually had a poundage associated with them until this year. Mr. Mufflett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just can you put in context what landings have been over the last couple of years for smooth dogfish in relation to what the quota is for 2016?
Give us just a moment. We don't have that immediately available, but I'll see what we can do to pull that up for you. Turn to the board for additional discussion, questions, motions. Margot?
So in our Amendment 9, landings in 2014 were 577.8. 2013 were 663. 2012 was 705. 2011 was 885. 2010 was 1219. 2009 was 861. So in the last several years, the quota that was implemented, which is based on the assessment of 1201, would be considerably higher. The only year that really approached the quota was 1 year of 2010.
Thank you. Tony?
If it's helpful to the board, the shares, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, were based on both historical allocations as well as more current landings. I think we used a combination of the two pieces in order to allocate.
And if the board does not take action on setting a quota here today, what are the potential implications? Margot?
Yeah. So we will count all landings against the federal quota. The dealers are required to, vessels will be required to sell to dealers, and the dealers are required to report. So we'll get landings. We don't have a state shares component, so we'll be managing the Atlantic as a whole. But in terms of our monitoring and landings, it includes both the federal and state permitted vessels.
So basically the fishery would just continue as it has been and just subject to federal monitoring at that point.
So state permitted fishermen are not subject to federal rules. Federally permitted fishermen need to follow the federal rules regardless of where they're fishing. But again, all the data will be coming into us and going into the quota monitoring.
And just to clarify with staff, there's nothing in the FMP that would require action. I'm giving staff a moment to delve into that. Did you have your hand up, Louis? Go ahead.
I guess there's a specific quota, I haven't seen it yet, that would go up on the board in terms of what we would be asked to approve. I would be concerned about not implementing that quota, because if we don't set this quota, then we run the risk of jurisdictions being disadvantaged by geography if one group starts catching more fish than their allotted share. So you could run the risk of, if states weren't managing their specific quota allocation, that some states might be disadvantaged by having the fishery shut down before their fishery even begins.
So the number is 1,201.7 metric tons. And again, we heard from the service what landings have looked like. 2010 was the only year in the last 6 that number was exceeded. So that's the number that would need to be put forth in a motion if the board so desires. Pat Augustine.
Thank you for that information, Mr. Chairman. I move that the board accept the 2016 smooth-down commercial quota for Atlantic region at 1.201.7 metric ton, a dry weight of 2.6 million pounds for smooth dogfish, smooth hound, I'm sorry.
Do I have a second to that motion? Dr. Daniel. Move to adopt the 2016 smooth hound, smooth dogfish quota of 1,201.7 metric tons. $2.6 million dry weight. Motion by Mr. Augustine, seconded by Dr. Daniel. Discussion on the motion. Mr. Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, does that mean, I'm looking at the chart here on page 2 of the handout, and I see those numbers. Now, is that without the percentages that are above there in that chart, or including the percentages are above that in that chart?
Can you clarify that question? You're asking the chart that was previously shown. Can you just clarify the question again?
Well, I see, yeah, there's the chart. I see the numbers that the motion made, the 1201 and the 2, but does that include this chart that shows the percentages for each state? That's included in this motion?
No, it's not included in the motion because it's already specified in Addendum 2 that these percentages would apply whenever a coastwide quota became available.
Oh, okay, so all we have to do is just approve those numbers, the totals.
Yes, just
Okay.
the total.
Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make sure I understand the difference. If we approve this motion, the quota will then be divided up by individual states, and we'll be expected to manage those individual quotas as a state, with consequences that I would imagine would be some form of payback provision to any harvest overage by state. However, if we choose not to approve this motion, we would then all be at the mercy of one another, and a total quota would be would be monitored, and as Dr. Daniel stated, some of us could be disadvantaged depending on migratory patterns and when the fish are available to different states along the coast. Is that a correct interpretation of where we stand at this point?
I'll turn to staff for the provisions of Amendment 2 with regards to the state-specific allocations.
So it is true that any amount, if a state goes over, then the next year that state will then have their quota reduced by that same amount. An unused quota may not be rolled over from one fishing year to the next.
So in short, yes, states would then be constrained to their percentage.
One other,
Follow-up?
sorry.
Oh, hang on, staff.
One other thing is that 2 or more states under mutual agreement may transfer or combine their smooth-out shark quota after commission approval.
Go ahead.
Just a quick follow-up. So it would be the state's responsibility then to manage their own quota and have a mechanism in place as far as their regulations are concerned to open and close the fishery rather than the federal waters or the federal government opening and closing the entire fishery altogether, correct?
I'll turn to Tony for a response.
That is correct, Mike, but do note that NOAA did indicate that they will close the fishery when 80% of the harvest has been reached in order to project the landings being, in order, at 80% they close because due to history, that's approximately when it's good in order to not exceed the quota. Sorry, I'm having trouble today. So it may be that NOAA will close the quota earlier than your state has harvested your full state share, and then only your state permitted fishermen could fish on that. Anybody with a federal permit would not be able to continue to fish, similar to the sea bass problem we have.
Okay, before you follow up with that, I have to deal with a minor procedural issue here. That being that the setting of the quota will be a final action. While the motion itself is valid, we have the issue that for this particular meeting, the maker of the motion is a meeting-specific proxy who cannot make motions for final actions, is what staff is advising me.
I believe he can actually make motions, he just cannot vote on those motions. He can make them, talk about them, participate in the discussion, but he may not vote.
Okay. All right. Great. So that was, glad we got that cleared up. All right. Moving on, Rob O'Reilly was next.
Bill Adler's comment makes me wonder about this motion. It was almost indicated that the share percentages are part of the motion, but it doesn't say that. It just says that it'll be a 2016 quota.
So again, those percentages were put in place in Amendment 2, which said they would go into effect when a quota was put in place. So by virtue of the motion whereby we are instituting a quota, those percentages would then go into effect.
Thank you.
Okay, any further discussion on the motion? Okay, seeing none, as it is a final action, this will require a roll call vote, and I'll also again add the reminder that meeting-specific proxies cannot vote on the final action. We'll give states a moment to caucus. All right, I'll turn to staff to go ahead. Again, the motion is move to adopt the 2016 smooth hound or smooth dogfish quota of 1,201.7 metric tons, 2.6 million pounds dry weight. Motion by Mr. Augustine, seconded by Dr. Daniel. I'll turn to staff to call the roll.
Maine, not present. Massachusetts,
Yes?
Rhode Island,
Yes.
Connecticut,
Yes.
New York,
Yes.
New Jersey,
Yes.
Delaware,
Yes.
Maryland,
Yes.
Virginia,
Yes.
North Carolina,
Yes.
South Carolina,
Yes.
Georgia,
Yes.
Florida.
Yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service,
Yes.
HMS,
Yes,
and NIMPS.
that's
Sorry.
me.
Oh, sorry. Already on the list. Done.
Okay, motion carries. Is there any other business to come before the board? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Made by Mr. Adler, seconded by Mr. Augustine. Without objection, the board's adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
The Horseshoe Crab Board will start in 5 to 10 minutes.